Hello, welcome to the BDR.net Lunch Gathering videos. We get together every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we cover a wide range of topics. So we invite you to enjoy this one and come visit us any Thursday that's convenient. We're at www.thebdr.net. That's thebdr.net. And we'd be happy to show you the engineering articles, IT articles, history articles, things that you'll find of interest. So again, thank you for coming. Enjoy the video. Take care. What I want to do is I'd like to turn our attention to our guest speaker today, Raj Mathur from Hammett Edison in San Francisco. And Raj is going to start our discussion off with this RF exposure public notice the FCC just sent out, and what that means for broadcasters, what you've done, what you need to do, but most importantly, what you need to know. So Raj, welcome, and turn over to you.
Thank you, Barry. I turned down my mic here a little bit. Does it sound better?
Excellent.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And I'm going to try sharing my presentation here.
There it is.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Okay, so as Barry said, I'd like to chat about changes to FCC RF exposure rules. And I appreciate being given the opportunity to do this at kind of the last minute. So let's get started. Okay. There we go. All right, a little bit about Hammett and Edison and myself. Hammett and Edison is a consulting engineering firm. We're located in Sonoma, which is about 45 minutes north of San Francisco. And we were established in 1952. So we're coming up on about 70 years here. We're a firm of 8 engineers, including 4 licensed professional engineers. Most of our work revolves around RF exposure assessments, broadcast station allocation, coverage and interference, broadcast auxiliary services, and we are the sole author of the TV study software, which is what the FCC uses to determine interference and coverage. I'm a licensed professional electrical engineer in California. I also have a master's degree in electrical engineering. I'm part of the IEEE RF Exposure Standard Setting Subcommittee, and I've been with Hammett and Edison for about 20 years now. So the FCC rules, the RF exposure rules, they are described in docket number 19226. There's 3 main parts to this docket. The first is a resolution of the NOI, Notice of Inquiry, and that NOI asked the question back in 2013, should the RF exposure limits change? The second part, which is going to be the real meat of my presentation here, is the second report and order. And the rules specified in that report and order, new and modified facilities must comply with those new rules after May 3 of this year. So that's obviously passed. So new and modified facilities must comply with those new rules now. Existing facilities have another 2 years until 2023 to comply with those new rules. And lastly, the third part in that docket was a notice of proposed rulemaking where the FCC is proposing further rule changes to radio frequency exposure. And those mostly deal with extending the frequency range for which the rules will be applicable, and other changes mostly for devices. So the first part, the resolution of the NOI, the big takeaway here is that there is no change to the existing limits. They stay the same. FCC received input from several federal agencies, most notably the FDA and EPA. As you can imagine, this was it's a fairly controversial topic, radio frequency exposure. So they received a bunch of comments. They say over 1,000 were filed. And this is the sentence that sort of highlights their main conclusion. I'll just read it here. After reviewing the extensive records submitted in response to that inquiry, we find no appropriate basis for, and thus decline to, propose amendments to our existing limits at this time. So again, no change to the RF exposure limits. So the question is, what is changing? And that's described in the second report and order, the second part of the docket, which defines new methods to determine and demonstrate compliance. And there's 3 sections to this. They're exemption, evaluation, and mitigation. And what exemption is for facilities or equipment that's so clearly compliant that they're exempt from routine evaluation. And if you're familiar with categorical exclusion, this sort of replaces that. The next step is evaluation. And that's if you don't meet exemption, then you evaluate your facility for compliance. And for the most part, there aren't any changes to this section, and we'll go over that a little bit later in the presentation. And the last part is mitigation, which is measures to restrict or limit RF exposure. And in this part, the FCC has really clarified their mitigation measures, and we'll talk more about that as well. So let's look at the first part, which is exemption. Exemption from the obligation to routinely demonstrate compliance. It's important to note that this is not an exemption from compliance itself. Exemption covers compliance with the public limit, but you also need to comply in some cases with the occupational limit. So it's something else to keep in mind with exemption. Previously, the FCC had service-specific list for categorical exclusion that they've now removed, and they've replaced that with a set of formulas. So they've really streamlined this. It doesn't depend on the type of service anymore. And the second reason, which I personally feel is a more important reason for doing this, is that previously it was possible to have a facility that was categorically excluded, but in fact did not comply with the exposure limits. So there could be potentially this bizarre situation where you're categorically excluded, but you don't actually meet the limits. And one example of how that's possible is if you have, for example, a 900-watt ERP cellular antenna, Omni antenna, on a 40-foot pole, which is fairly typical on a utility pole, and let's say there's a tall building 10 feet away. Well, previously the FCC considered a 900-watt, 40-foot high Omni cellular facility to be categorically excluded. But in fact, if there's a building 10 feet away, it may not comply with the limits. So the new formulas, as we'll see, they prevent this kind of thing from happening. So those service-specific criteria have been replaced by 3 things. First, there's a blanket 1 milliwatt low power exemption. Second, there's a SAR-based exemption for distances from 0.5 centimeters to 40 centimeters. 40 centimeters is about 16 inches. So, devices and things like wireless microphones that are intended to be operated close to the user, and for frequencies from 0.3 gigahertz to 6 gigahertz. And I should add, SAR means specific absorption rate. It's measured in watts per kilogram. So it's power divided by mass, and that's generally mass of tissue. And so SAR is measured as a temperature rise in tissue. The MPE, maximum permissible exposure-based exemptions, they are valid for separation distances greater than lambda over 2 pi, and for frequencies from 0.3 megahertz to 100 gigahertz. So here's the SAR-based exemption for a single source. These are the formulas. I'm not gonna spend too much time on it because, like I said, these are for devices where, wireless microphone manufacturer may use this to show that they are exempt. But just real quickly, and I hope you can see my mouse here, the power threshold for exemption is based on what the FCC is calling ERP 20 centimeters. So if we look at something that's intended for operation between 20 centimeters and 40 centimeters, then this ERP 20 centimeter is defined here based on frequency. So for UHF, it would be 2040 times the frequency. And then if that's equal to or less than, if your device is equal to or less than that, then it meets the power threshold. If the intended use is less than 20 centimeters, then there's this other factor, it's a log factor that comes in that reduces this ERP20 number more. The MPE-based exemptions for single source, and these are exemptions that would apply to broadcast facilities. They again have a threshold ERP, and they're valid for separation distances greater than lambda over 2 pi. These are derived from the RF exposure limits, assuming a single worst case reflection. So they take the basic formula for power density, assume a single worst case reflection, add in the limit, and then if you do the conversion to threshold ERP, this is what you get. That's where these formulas come from. Quick note on R, the separation distance, that's the minimum distance between the antenna and any publicly accessible area. So I'm going to just quickly go back to this situation that I described where the cellular facility would be categorically excluded previously, but would not comply with the limits. And now the R is 10 feet. And so you have to factor in this distance. And when you do that, you find that the facility is no longer exempt. And so it avoids that whole situation. So you could, do the calculations here, or, on our website, we're going to have a calculator soon, which will let you do that. And the way we look at it is kind of the reverse of what's on here. We look at it as that your ERP, and so we ask you to plug that in, and it'll just give you R, and it'll give you your separation distance, which I think is a little bit better than trying to figure out what the threshold ERP is. So we've looked at single sources for exemption. What do you do when there are multiple sources? And the FCC has this a nifty summation formula that helps you do that. It looks a little complicated, but I'm going to try to walk us through it a little bit, and then I've got an example here to show you how it works. This first summation term here is essentially the PTH that we saw in the SAR exemption, and it's that ratio of the SAR exemption, the ratio of the MPE exemption, and then a third factor, which is the ratio of anything else that might be in the site. So maybe you take measurements, and that's what you evaluate it. And if those ratios are less than 1, then those multiple sources are exempt. So like I said, let's look at an example to see how that might work. It's a real simple example, but hopefully it'll help. So if there's 2 FM stations on a tower, 10 kilowatts each, ERP. One has a 100-meter separation distance, the other has an 80-meter separation distance. And the threshold ERP, let's go back one here. For FM, we'd be right in this frequency range. The threshold ERP is 3.83 R squared. 3.83, and this didn't quite paginate right here, but that's supposed to be R squared, 3.83 R squared. And so if you plug that in, we'll get 38.3 kilowatts for the first FM station and 24.5 kilowatts for the second one. So those are the 2 threshold ERPs. And so then we go into this middle summation term, ERP divided by threshold ERP, ERP divided by threshold ERP for both. Add those up and we get 0.67, which is less than 1. And so both these FM stations would be categorically exempt. I'm presuming here that there's no SAR-based devices and that there's no other transmitting sources, so there's no other source for RF exposure nearby. Right, so that was exemption. Evaluation, and as I mentioned, there's really no change to evaluation methodology for broadcast sites. That stays the same. There's some computational changes for SAR. They allow you to now use any method to do that, and they remove some minimum distance requirements. Right, so let's move on to mitigation. The FCC now defines exposure categories, and these come from the IEEE standard in the IEEE documents many years ago, and the FCC has adopted them now. Category 1 is an area that's less than the general population limit. Category 2, between the public and occupational limit. Category 3, between the occupational and 10 times the occupational limit. And category 4, that are above 10 times the occupational limit. And you'll notice that this line here, which areas above 10 times, is dashed, while the other two are solid lines. That's because these are actually defined limits. There's only two defined limits in the FCC rules, the public limit and the occupational limit. But they've added this third, it's not really a limit, but a third level where you're required to do something else if you exceed 10 times the occupational limit. So what do you do in each of these exposure categories? Category 1, again, below the public limit, you don't need to do anything. Optional, you could post a green information sign. Category 2, again, above public limit, below occupational limit, you're required to post blue notice signs. You're required to implement positive access control, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but essentially it's locking doors or putting up effective fences, and provide RF safety training. Category 3, which is above occupational but below 10 times occupational, post yellow caution signs and install controls or indicators, which are things like chains or paints. Category 4, which again is above 10 times the occupational limit, post orange warning signs or red danger signs. And the danger sign you'd post if there's a immediate and serious injury that might occur. Otherwise, you'd post a warning sign. And in this category, you could do power reduction, personal protective equipment, or lockout tagout. The FCC has now clearly defined 5 items that need to be in signs. So earlier, they didn't really say what specifically needed to be in warning signs, I should say alerting signs, but now they clearly define what needs to be there. And there's 5 things. You need appropriate signal, word, and color. So for example, a blue notice sign. You need the RF energy advisory symbol, which is this thing right here. You need a description of the RF source. So for example, transmitting antennas. You need to describe behavior necessary to comply with the limits. So for example, do not climb the tower unless the antennas are de-energized. And lastly, you need up-to-date contact information. So here's an example of a warning sign that would meet those 5 requirements. There's a signal word, the symbol, transmitting antennas, the behavior that is needed, and some space for adding in contact information. And I want to add at this point that at a number of broadcast sites, large ones that I've been to, I found that really the only changes they need to make is update their signs, and that might be true for your sites as well. Then positive access control. The FCC says this is mitigation by proactive preclusion. So you need to proactively do something to keep people out of areas that exceed the public limit. So that could be locked doors, ladder cages, effective fences, and it does not include natural barriers. Regarding training, the FCC kind of punted on this in the docket. They direct OET to provide further guidance on training. So right now it's a little unclear what constitutes training. Is it enough to tell somebody, hey, don't go into this area? Or do you need to have more detailed training? For example, in the IEEE documents, there's a couple of pages of topics that that cover training. So, which is it? How detailed does this need to be? And they've directed OET to provide further guidance on that. And OET is also updating the main OET 65 documents and supplements, including Supplement A for broadcast stations. And I'm part of a group of engineers that's helping the OET update Supplement A. And we're hoping to get all that done and out to the public in the next couple of months here. So lastly, I have an example here, just bringing all the mitigation together in a simple example. I've just chosen a rooftop site. So this is looking top down on a rooftop. There's the roof access hatch, and then lock the roof access hatch. So that would be your positive access control that you did. You lock the hatch. You'd mark boundaries. So here's a little boundary you can mark on the roof. Beyond this, levels exceed the public limit, which is this blue shaded area. Yellow is where areas exceed the occupational limit, and orange is areas that exceed 10 times the limit. And so you have boundaries for the blue, boundary for the yellow area, the occupational, and the orange is so small that you don't really need a boundary. You just post a sign there. And then there's also signs posted around the boundary that exceeds the occupational limit and the public limit. And then lastly, you need to provide training as well. So that's all I have. Happy to answer any questions, but just to summarize the whole thing in a sentence or two, there's no change to the FCC limits. There are changes to exemption. There are changes to how you handle mitigation. And for most broadcast sites, there should be minimal changes, possibly only changes in signage. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Raj. I'll kick in with the first question here on your last sign training. Is this something that we have to notify the commission that we have done, or is this part of the somewhat we don't know yet what's going to be required?
So regarding training, you don't have to notify the commission that you've trained. They consider that one part of compliance. So perhaps you may need to at some point tell them that your facility complies, but I don't believe there's any requirement to tell them presently how you've trained, if you've trained. That's just what they expect. And I should add that the training requirement has been there since 2013. So that was in the 2013 report and order, that workers that may need to access areas that exceed the public limit need to be trained in RF safety. It's just not clear right now what that training entails.
Okay, another question has been raised. When you're measuring here for the distances, is that from the center of radiation?
Yes, I would say that is. It's from the center of the radiation of the antenna.
Which then would raise the question of what about a half wave spaced antenna?
So in regard to the center of a half-wave spaced antenna?
Well, the distance, would the fact of a half wave space cause a change in distance requirement?
No, it's the same thing. So, I realized that, for a half wave space, the downward radiation is significantly lower than a full wave spaced antenna. But essentially what the FCC is doing with those formulas is they are presuming that maximum radiation in all directions. And so it's a worst case simplified criteria to determine exemption. Now, if you don't meet that exemption, you still have the same evaluation available to you as before, which is a more detailed calculation where you can factor in the antenna radiation pattern. You can factor in the fact that the downward radiation of a half-wave spaced antenna is much lower, and you can show compliance that way.
Okay, good. Now, one more question, and then I'll let anybody else jump in that would like to. And that was raised for us. What about the responsibility when you have diplex, triplex, multiplex sites, and you know that when you put your antenna up that everything was measured, but now it may have changed? Do you need to have paperwork to show where it is?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the FCC has had a long-standing. It's in the rules actually. It's called colloquially the 5% rule, and what that says essentially is that if you are less than a 5% contributor to RF exposure in an area that exceeds the limit, then you are not responsible for bringing that area into compliance. Or conversely, if you are more than a 5% contributor to an area that exceeds the limit, you are responsible. So, and that is still in place. And so if there is an area that exceeds the limit, then it is the responsibility of anybody that's contributing more than 5% to that area to bring it into compliance. So that's where the responsibility lies for sites with multiple antennas or diplex, triplex antennas. That's how the FCC assigns responsibility.
So what do you recommend that they have each of the stations or as a group hire someone to do the measurements and send it back?
Yeah, I would say a group works more efficiently. I mean, you can just, because anybody who's going to go do the measurements is going to measure cumulative levels as well as potentially individual levels for the stations, because you need to cumulatively comply with the limits. So it just makes sense to me to just get together if you're at one site and have a combined study done to see what the RF exposure levels are.
Okay, I'll do one more, and that has to do with this time limit. It's mentioned in one of your first slides, new or modified situations require immediate notification. Those that are not, well, they've already told them, the FCC on the renewal application, that there's been no substantial change. What do we need to know for future use?
So you're asking about the new and modified facilities, what they need to do?
No, those we know they need to immediately file.
Yes.
And that, by the way, one of the things that is mentioned, I don't know if you mentioned or not, I might have missed it. ham is now included in the RF exposure
It is,
rules.
yes. That's correct.
But let's just say that I filed an application here because Arizona comes up on June 1st. And I've checked off where it says no major changes or substantial changes. What do I need to gather over the next 2 years, or just leave it as is?
What I would do is I'd make sure that your operation complies with the new limits. So if you're a existing facility, you're correct. You can just check no changes and file in June, and you're good. But then you have 2 years to make sure that you meet the new rules. Like I said, that could be as simple as updating signs, making sure you have training, and you might be done. So it may not be a burden or too much of a burden on broadcasters to make sure that that's happening.
I would assume that if you're operating a tower and then somebody else comes, they now have the responsibility for doing these measurements. And the question, what if they don't?
Yeah, so a newcomer, if it's a broadcast station, in the application, there's a section that asks for documentation on RF exposure. So as part of the application, they have to show that they either meet that 5% rule that I spoke about earlier, or if they don't, then that cumulatively the site will still comply with the RF exposure limits. So that is checked at the application stage. In some cases, we've seen that the FCC themselves ask for post-construction measurements to confirm that cumulatively the site will comply with the FCC limits. So I have seen them do that at large broadcast sites.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to step back now. Anyone else that has a question, please feel free to unmute either with your space bar or alternate A, and Raj will be happy to answer.
Yeah, question on signage. Say you have a 4-tower AM array. You would need a sign on each face of the fence. So in theory, you would need like 16 signs.
Not necessarily. So the signs you need, you could maybe just have a sign at the entrance to the fence at the gate. So if there's an obvious access point, then you'd post a sign there. And even then, you don't have to. So here, let me go back one slide here. So here's the example of a roof access hatch. But if we just imagine, that it's a fenced area, then you don't necessarily have to post signs on the fence unless when you immediately enter the fenced area, you exceed the limit. You only need to post signs at the point beyond which you will exceed the limit. And so you'll notice here, I don't have any signs in the roof access hatch. I don't need to. Somebody could go up here and they'd be in this corner, they would not exceed the limits. It's only when they cross over to the rest of the roof that they're exceeding the limit. And that's where you need the signs. So the same sort of logic applies to fenced areas. If you're entering a fenced area and you're not immediately in excess of the limit, then you don't need to post signs. But at that point, then you need to have some other mechanism to mark the area where you exceed the FCC limit and post signs on that area. So there's some flexibility on where you can post signs. You could post it at the entrance to the fenced area. You could mark the area that exceeds separately and post signs there. So there's, like I said, some flexibility with that. So I hope that answers your question. Is that what you were asking?
Well, yeah, it gets there. I'm thinking of a field that you have 4 or multiple antennas out in there, and you have fences around the individual. I'm making a line with my mouse and you can't see it. I realize that. You have a fence around each one of the antennas, but there's no real barrier other than the driveway, perhaps, going to the field.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So you've got fences around the tower bases, is what you're
Right.
saying. Yeah, okay. Yes, so in that case, yes, you need to post signs at the fences, and I would then recommend that yes, you post. It's probably better to post signs at all 4 faces of the fence. So yes, 16 signs total.
Okay. Let me just jump in here and make the point that for many AM stations, standalone low power kilowatt, if your fence is 10 feet from the tower, you're already outside the range and you don't have to have signs at that point. So you wouldn't need 4 signs around the 4 different bases unless one of those towers was high enough power and the fence was short enough that you would be inside the range.
Yeah.
Correct, Raj?
Yes, that's correct. I'm making the presumption here that inside the fence you're exceeding the limits, and so if you are, then you need the signs.
Raj, I have a question that I asked yesterday, and that's basically when you are doing measurements and find hotspots, how can spatial averaging be best applied?
Hi, Richard. I appreciate you sitting through this the second time in 2 days. Regarding your question, spatial averaging methodology is unchanged. You can still spatially average, and like we spoke about yesterday, Typically how I handle it is I'll take peak measurements, because spatial measurements typically take a little bit of time to do. And then if I find any hotspots, areas that exceed the limit, and those areas I'll go back and I'll spatially average. The FCC hasn't specified exactly how you're supposed to spatially average, but there is guidance in other documents like IEEE documents of how you do that. And how we typically do it is I'll spatially average from 2 meters down to 0.5 meters. So in my case, just above my head down to my knees. And I'll do that in 4 orthogonal directions, trying to take the average out, the body out of it. And then I'll average those 4 readings to get a spatial average at that location.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Please feel free.
Yeah, Raj. I'll turn my camera back on. There we go. Yeah, just as an example, I have 2 recently licensed new sites, and of course they both have the applications for them, and they were licensed as they were built as per the applications. So they do have the engineering studies that takes into account the other users on the tower and the statements that we contribute less than 5% of the total, the RF exposure. And so would that be considered sufficient as having a proper analysis?
Yes, so if you file your application and you've done the calculations and shown that you're less than 5%, then yes, that should be all that's needed. As far as the public exposure is concerned, you're still going to want to make sure that you comply with the occupational limits, and that you post appropriate signs, that the workers that may need to access the tower are trained. So all that stuff still needs to happen. And if it's an existing site, that process may already be there.
Okay, thank you. And if I can back up with another one, there's let's see, how do I phrase it? I think there was some wording in FCC regulation about certain people are assumed to be aware of RF exposure matters, and those would be people like typically, obviously, the engineers that work at stations, and also tower crews and people like that. But then there's other contractors like air conditioning, and if you just have some other contractor out there doing some work for you that isn't normally in the business of working in these areas, then has anything changed on how they address making awareness to those type of people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. No, there's been no significant change in how the FCC defines the public and how they define occupational workers. So it's the same essential definitions. So to be qualified as an occupational worker, you need to have knowledge and control. So you need to have knowledge of RF exposure, and that gets into the training part of it. And you need to have control over your exposure. And that's where the training comes in, but also the signs come into play there. The signs provide you with some amount of control where you can, know, okay, now I'm going to enter an area that exceeds the public limit. Here's some contact information. I can call these guys and have them de-energize the antenna if I need to go into an area that exceeds the occupational limit, let's say. So those 2 elements, the knowledge and control, are still in place. that part, the FCC has not changed.
Okay, thank you.
Raj,
Yes.
if you're working on a non-English speaking station, do you have to have the signs in multiple languages?
Yeah, again, a really good question. So the FCC is silent on language. A number of local jurisdictions have rules on that. So I'll just take an example here in San Francisco. They require all signs to be in 3 languages: English, Spanish, and Chinese. And so every sign here is posted in 3 languages. I'd say that, if you have a tower where, a Spanish language station, if you expect that the workers would understand that better, I would say go ahead and do that. Post signs in 2 languages. That way you're covered. So I think it's, the FCC, I think at this point expects just reasonableness, where if you think it'll help to post signs in multiple languages, that you should do so. More questions?
I just got one asking if you could post signs in Klingon.
Absolutely, if you're on the Enterprise.
Watch out for the warp coil, right?
Yes.
Well, Raj, first of all, I'll invite you to throw the slide back up with your contact information should anyone would like to have a chat with you and or engage your services. You don't mind answering simple little questions that come.
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah, no, please feel, if you think of anything else later, then feel free to email or call.
We're going to post this video up on the BDRnet channel on YouTube, and you may get some delayed response. And
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah,
so
happy to answer any more questions.
very good. Well, again, I want to thank you not only for your presentation, which answers a lot of questions that many of us have had since the public notice came out, but as many didn't know, unless they caught it from Richard's comments, you did this literally on a moment's notice, and I'm extremely grateful for your doing that, and want to invite you back to talk to us more about the services that you guys provide.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I'm glad we were able to get it done, and thank you, Richard, for connecting us.